Well, those of you who are here, I just want to welcome everyone. My name's Mike Ignatowski. I'm kind of your MC for today. This is our second Common Ground for Texas Zoom meeting here. For those of you having trouble keeping track of such things, yes, this is the weekend. In fact, it's a holiday weekend. When we start off these meetings, I usually like to thank everyone for coming because there's just so many other activities going on and so many other places to be in Austin on a Saturday, except, well, right now, not so much, but thanks for coming anyway. Sit back and relax, grab something to eat or drink if you want, and enjoy our topic today, which is something we've been interested in for quite a while, ranked choice voting. We're going to have an opportunity for some group participation in an online voting experiment later in the meeting. Just some quick housekeeping details. As I said, everyone is on mute except for the speaker. But if you choose to do so, your video will still be showing so everyone can see your smiling faces. You can, in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, switch to either speaker mode or gallery mode. Speaker mode lets you see a big screen of just the person talking and presenting. And gallery mode lets you see the whole collection of people there. For an event like this, it's often good to switch it to the speaker mode. So you can see the specific speaker, one speaker talking at a time. And eventually some of the slides they will be showing. There's also a button at the bottom of your screen to activate a chat window. Feel free to click on that. You can send in your questions on the chat window at any time, but only the moderator, Hamilton Richards, will see them. And later in the meeting, we'll have a question and answer period to actually address the questions coming in. And occasionally Ham may send out notices in the chat window that everyone can see. So it's a good idea to open that now if you get a chance. Go down to the bottom of your screen and click on it. Okay, with that, I would like to turn it over to Joanne Richards, the president of Common Ground for Texans, for some announcements and the president's message. Joanne.
Thank you, Mike, as always. So for the announcements, the April video on the history of polarization that took place with Michael Lind is now available on our website at cg4tx.org. Our June meeting date has been changed since we're doing Zoom meetings. We no longer are required to stick to an Austin Public Library event. So our June meeting has been moved to June 13th, which is also a Saturday at 2 o'clock when Mike will interview Dana de Beauvoir, and we will talk about election security during the COVID-19 election cycle, how that will affect our July special election and runoff election, and how that might affect our November election. She is very vocal, extremely knowledgeable. We have posed several questions to her that we hope she will answer, and then of course you will all have an opportunity to ask as well. So the agenda for today is that I'll be speaking about ranked choice voting, how it works and why we want to allow it in Texas. Currently, the Secretary of State in the Election Code has eliminated ranked choice voting as a possibility. Then there will be a Q&A and on that presentation. Then Dan will come in and explain other advances in voting reforms. There'll be another Q&A period then too. The slideshows will be available on the blog after the video, along with the video, and usually takes about a week for that to take place, but there's no need to take notes because you'll have access to all of these slides. So with that, I don't know if anybody else has any announcements.
Just want to point out in the middle of that, we will offer them a chance to actually engage in a ranked choice voting experiment.
Right.
And details to be announced after Joanne's presentation.
So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm a novice at this, so let's hope that this works. Yay, it worked. Okay, so I have several slides to go over fairly quickly. Common Ground for Texans has joined a group that's called Ranked Choice Voting for Texas. It is a statewide group, and we have been working diligently to have a strategy for how to bring ranked choice voting possibility to the state of Texas. So what I want to do is begin by taking a look at how ranked choice voting works. The first thing that happens is that you get a ballot, and that here is step one. And this is, I have two slides showing the current system that we use for voting now. The first one is called the first past the post system. It's plurality voting, the kind of voting that we do for our governor in the state of Texas. And so here we have 5 candidates who are running, and you can see the count here, and Jane Doe wins with 30% of the vote. The problem, of course, with this kind of voting is that someone can win an election without having a majority vote. So who do they actually represent? And that's somewhat problematic. The second current system, which is what's called the 2-round runoff system or majority voting. And in this case, the situation is the same tally in the votes, but John Q and Jane Doe both go to a runoff election. And there are various challenges because of runoff elections. One of them is the additional time and cost if the runoff election is needed, as we will see on July 14th, for example, with our runoff for various positions. There's typically much lower voter turnout in runoff elections. Voters feel limited to voting for a majority candidate. I don't want to waste my vote, so instead of voting who I really think that I really like, I'm going to vote for who I think might win, and that can be problematic. And of course, the spoiler effect, where there may be several candidates with similar positions, and they split the vote. And because they split the vote, neither of them may move to a runoff election. So both of those systems are the current systems that we use, and there is a better system that's out there. And so here are some of the advantages to ranked choice voting. It's also known as instant runoff voting. One is that it saves money. And the reason it saves money is because there is no runoff. So it saves money for both counties who are running elections, parties who are running elections, and candidates who have to continue to campaign. So all in all, it's problematic. There is greater choice because you're voting for your first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice candidates, however many candidates there are in the ballot. You don't have to rank all of the people on your ballot, but you have the opportunity to rank as many as you like. Therefore, most people then have a stronger voice because I don't have to vote for who I think is going to win. I can vote for who I would like to win. And in fact, what also happens is that there's less negative campaigning, because if I'm a candidate and I'm not your first choice, I definitely want you to be my second choice. So I'm not going to be bad-mouthing other candidates. I'm going to be talking about the issues that are important to me so that I can influence you to vote for me. So many use ranked choice voting today. My sister happens to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They have a system of ranked choice voting that they use for their city council. It's been in effect since 1941. So this is not a new concept. It has taken place in various places that you may be unaware of. So the best picture for the Oscars is by ranked choice voting. I'm a member of a book club, and we used ranked choice voting to rank the books that we want to read. So there are lots of different ways of ranked choice voting taking place. Maine currently is the only state where statewide ranked choice voting will be taking place shortly. And I happen to be in Hawaii at the moment and anxiously trying to get home. And ranked choice voting just started in Hawaii this election. So how does ranked choice voting work? Well, here's a typical ballot, and here are my choices. This is not a secret ballot today. Freddie Rubble has gotten my first choice vote. Mary Hill's gotten my second choice vote. My third choice vote went to Jane Doe, and I didn't bother to vote for my fourth or fifth choice because I didn't particularly care for either one of them. So I rank my, my ballot accordingly. And now we have to go through the counting of the ballots. And so all the first choices are counted. And if a candidate, excuse me, gets more than half, 50%, 0.1%, then they win the election. But if not, in this case, we have John Q getting 25% of the vote, Jane Doe getting 30%, 20% for Fred Rubble, and Mary Hill getting 15%, Joe Smith getting 10% of the total vote. So those are the tallies for the first choice votes for all the people who voted in this particular election. If this were a plurality election, then Jane Doe would have won. If it's a two-round runoff, then John Q and Jane Doe would have advanced, and we would have elected them by 50% of the vote. So in this case, in ranked choice voting, what happens is that the person who gets the fewest votes, their second choice votes, or the vote, their second choice votes get redistributed. In this case, it's Joe Smith, and 5% of his votes went to John Q, and 5% of his second choice votes went to Jane Doe. And so as a result, you can see now that John Q has 30% of the vote, Jane Doe has 35%, Fred Rubble and Mary Hill's votes have not changed. But again, neither one of them has gotten 50% of the vote. So we have to continue counting. Here then, Mary Hill's votes get redistributed. In this case, it's either her second choice votes on her ballot, or if John Smith, excuse me, was her second choice, then it would go to her third choice vote. So whoever has not been eliminated, their next vote will count. So as a result of the redistribution of, or the distribution of Mary Hill's second or third choice votes, Jane Doe got 50% of the vote, so she now is declared the winner. So in ranked choice voting, 50%, the winner has to meet the majority vote of 50% or more, unlike plurality voting where they don't. So ranked choice voting for Texans is a nonpartisan, nonprofit grassroots effort. The chair resides in Houston, but we have members all over, from Houston to Dallas to Austin to El Paso and down into the Valley. We advocate for Texans to adopt ranked choice voting at the Texas legislature. As I mentioned, currently, ranked choice voting is not permitted. What we are asking for is for it to be allowed under certain circumstances. And so we have a short-term hope for legislation in the next legislative session. The near term is for military and overseas voters. Military voters and overseas voters in a in a situation of a runoff election have a problem of a delay in getting their ballots. And so this would, if there was a ranked choice voting ballot, they would only have to vote once and get their votes into the appropriate county where their county votes are counted. So it allows for a decrease in time for them to be able, a decrease in time for their votes to be able to get to where they need to go quickly. The second is for Texas primary elections, that the Texas Democratic Party and the Texas Republican Party should be able to use ranked choice voting to within their primary so that there is not a runoff in the primary. In this case, our July 14th primary would not be necessary, except for the fact that we have a special election. In special elections, we could also have ranked choice voting, which would mean that in special elections, it's important, excuse me, to have ranked choice voting because it decreases the amount of time that people in the state or a county are unrepresented. So between the time of a special election and then a runoff election, it could take several months for an outcome to take place. And this is problematic because then people are not representatives, especially if the legislature is currently in session. Even when our legislature is not in session, it's still problematic because there are committee meetings that are taking place. And so those positions then would be filled by someone. The last is for nonpartisan municipal elections and or in school board elections. And again, the same thing, the same advantage occurs. There is less money spent. The conversations between the candidate and potential voters is much more positive. Less money is spent, as I said, and you have more choice. In the long term, what we would like to do is for Texas local, state, and federal elections to be done by ranked choice voting as well. So to catch you up to speed, in the last legislative session, we actually did have two bills that were filed. One was filed for Texas primary elections, and one was filed for nonpartisan municipal and school board elections. The state of Texas legislative session is draconian in that it usually takes at least 3 legislative sessions for a bill to even get a hearing in a committee. We have typically something like 6,000 bills filed for a 140-day session. So it takes quite some time for a push to be made. So it's important then that we allow for an inclusive democracy, just as our founding fathers intended. So what we are asking, at least those people who live in Texas, is to support our efforts, the ranked choice voting efforts, by signing up as a supporter on our website so that we can call upon you to call your legislator when a bill has been filed, liking us on social media, letting your elected officials know you support ranked choice voting, and inviting us to speak to your local organizations or clubs. So join our campaign, donate so that we can support our website and our speakers forums, outreach to the public through about ranked choice voting, and submit lobbying efforts for the 2021 legislative session. One of the ways that I participated in an outreach session was during our primary election. So people were standing in line outside to vote. And I figured, okay, so maybe it was time for me to talk to people about ranked choice voting. Did they understand what ranked choice voting was? Were they willing to listen to what ranked choice voting was instead of sort of standing there twiddling their thumbs? And so I probably spoke to about 40, maybe 60 people, and 40 people signed up on our mailing list. So it's important really to talk to friends and family about what ranked choice voting is about. We're not asking for ranked choice voting to be required. We're asking for ranked choice voting to be allowed. So that's all I have to say about ranked choice voting in Texas. Thanks a lot. For the Q&A.
Just one question. I learned about ranked choice voting in college about 15 years ago. It seems like such a great and obvious solution. I'm really surprised it isn't more ubiquitous by now. What are the main hurdles to getting it enacted or main arguments against it?
Well, as far as I know, ranked choice voting used to be in the election code. And in 1985, for some reason, it was dropped. And no one has an explanation for why that happened. Ranked choice voting has become much more widespread, and people now are learning about it more. I think what I will do is ask Dan to answer the second question, because he's going to talk a little bit about various different methods by which ranked choice voting votes are counted. In the scenario that I presented here, it is very possible that someone who was not the first choice of many folks' votes in the first round actually does not become the winner. And they feel disgruntled when that happens. But there are other ways of doing the calculation so that you avoid that kind of a situation to take place. That's the one hurdle that I know. The second hurdle that I know is that people don't like change. And our legislators and our city council folks, they like the system that we have because they won. On the other hand, one of the things that the ranked choice voting group is looking at is those people who are going into a runoff election. And if an incumbent loses in that runoff, how do they now feel about ranked choice voting? Because they might have won. And there are about 10 or 15 incumbents who are running in runoff elections on July 14th. So we're looking very closely at the outcome of those. If they win, we're going to talk to them as well because they had to spend more money. If they lose, we're going to talk to them and see whether they would help us.
I do have one more question. We're asking for ranked choice voting to be allowed but not required. And why is that?
Well, because for municipal elections, we think it is up to each municipality to decide how they want to vote. Once we have some municipalities or if there are some if it's a party primary, my guess is that both parties will do this by ranked choice voting, not just one party. But if we have some success in some areas of voting, we might be able then to see more success following. So we thought we would start small and work up rather than big and be potentially less successful.
Oh, I don't hear
and I guess I could say something else, and that is that there are quite a few states that have ranked choice voting available to military and overseas voters because of the convenience for them. And that has been generally accepted in many states, which is reassuring. So, and so we've targeted counties where we have military bases. And San Antonio is probably the largest, and El Paso, where there are more military bases than in any of the other counties.
I do have one comment. Thanks to Joanne and you, I guess meaning me. She needs to leave now, but she's glad to have our CV, ranked choice voting, explained so clearly. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you very much for the comment. And I might suggest that because we're in Zoom, there are people who are on this call from all over the country. And some of you may have experience with ranked choice voting. And if you do, if you put a comment in your comment field, then Ham can unmute you, in fact, so you can talk about your own experience. So I guess I'll pass the baton back to either Mike or Dan.
Dan is up next. Ham, you may have to unmute him. And Dan, you may want to talk about the actual polling experiment we're going to do here at the beginning of the presentation.
Yeah, why don't we share that URL with everyone in the chat one more time? It's just an exercise of ranked choice voting. Choose your favorite or what you consider the best cartoon character of all time. And we've got 5 choices for you. And so we'll give some time for everyone to weigh in on that question while I present my slides. So there's the URL in the chat window. And let me share my screen now. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And now we're seeing my screen, I think. Right? Okay. So I'm going to be talking about ranked choice voting and some different variations and alternative voting methods to ranked choice voting. I'm the Secretary of Common Ground for Texans. I've been that for about 5 years, so, well, maybe more like 7. Anyway, I'm a software developer by trade and training, and I've also done some writing these last few years. I've been really interested in this subject and actually wrote a book about it, which was published last fall, which I'll share with you a little bit later, which basically has to do with the connection between voting methods and our party system. I feel like we need more choices in this country, like most other countries have, and so that's intimately tied up with our electoral method. And why is that? That's basically because of the spoiler effect. So that's part of the motivation, for me at least, for trying to move to ranked choice voting, is to get around that. The fact that people can't just vote their conscience, like Joanne said earlier, they can't just vote for what they want, but they have to consider who is the possible winner, and they have to engage in tactical voting because of this potential spoiler effect. You don't want to throw away your vote. And so if you look at this pie chart here, basically we have a potential spoiler in the orange area because let's say that orange is somewhat like red and not so much like blue. Well, if orange wasn't in the race, then red would be winning a plurality, or actually a majority of the pie here. And so red would be elected. But because orange is in the race and a few people vote for them, it spoils the election for red. And you can see that blue, I don't know if you can see exactly, but I think that blue here has slightly more than red. So if you're operating this election by plurality voting, blue would win. So orange has spoiled this election. And this is formulated in political science as something known as Duverger's law. A French political scientist named Maurice Duverger in a 1951 book described this, saying that when you have a first past the post or plurality voting system and you have single member districts, that tends to lead to a two-party system because people don't want to take a chance on a third party. They're afraid of that spoiler effect. But the thing is that a lot of voting methods don't suffer so much from the spoiler effect. And that's where we come to ranked choice voting. If you like orange, but your second choice is red, then you can vote orange as your number 1 preference and red as your number 2 and blue as your number 3, or not even bother to rank blue on your ballot. That's the idea, so that you can vote your conscience. And so here I'm just like explaining, just for completeness sake, what the method is. Joanne has already been over this, but you fill out your ballot, you choose your top whatever choices up to the number of candidates that are running. And it should be optional, in my opinion. It's not always optional. There's a lot of different variations, but I think the best way to do it is to make it optional for you to rank as many choices as you want. So if you only know one candidate who's your favorite and you only want to rank that one, that's fine. If you want to rank the top 3 or the top 4, that's fine too. If you want to rank all of them, that's fine too. So this goes by the name of alternative vote in some countries like Britain, or preferential voting in other places, and instant runoff voting, which is actually the main version of it, because ranked choice voting is actually a family of methods. It really just says that the voter is ranking their choices. And then how that's handled on the other side, on the back end, so to speak, in the tallying, is dependent on the exact system being used. But this has been used in many places around the world. It's been used in Australia for over 100 years now for their House of Representatives. It was invented in the 1800s, and there's really not much question about its effectiveness or its validity or its fairness, I would say. So the tallying in instant runoff voting, I'm showing a flow chart here. Again, this is, I think Joanne kind of covered this, but basically you just count everybody's top choices, unless they've been eliminated, of course. So you count their top uneliminated choices and then ask, does any candidate have a majority of those? If yes, then they win. If no, then you eliminate the last place candidate and redistribute their votes. And so notice, one thing to notice about this method is that the second choice preferences and lower are not getting counted in any particular round. It goes by round, and in each round, only one choice of the voter is being counted. That differs a little bit from some other types of tallying, as I discuss here on the next slide, such as the board account, where you have the same ranked choice ballots. You're ranking 1, 2, 3, whatever, however many you want, but then you assign points to all of the rankings on all of the ballots. And if you have n candidates, say you have 5 candidates, then a number 1 ranking would get you 4 points. Not ranking the candidate gets them 0 points. And so then you take all those points from all the ballots and you just add them all up. And whoever has the most points is the winner. Now, so that sounds very simple, and it is, and it's nice for your book club, or you're getting together with friends and you're going to choose what type of champagne to buy or something like that. It's a real convenient, handy little hand calculating method to use, but it does suffer from some disadvantages compared to instant runoff voting, such as not satisfying what's known as the majority criterion, which is one of many mathematical criteria used to evaluate voting methods that people, mathematicians and political scientists have come up with, and also social choice theorists. So social choice is kind of a mathematical area of social science, and I can't really define it precisely. But anyway, people who are involved in those fields are very interested in these criteria for evaluating methods. The unfortunate fact, though, is that no voting method satisfies all the desirable criteria, and that was shown by Kenneth Arrow in the 50s, and later by the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem, which basically says that all voting methods are subject to being played, essentially, to tactical voting. Now, the board account and instant runoff voting and plurality voting, everything we've talked about so far, are single winner methods. But there are also multi-winner methods, and that's what I want to talk about next. Here's a slide with a bunch of different methods. Let me go over some of these single winner methods first, and then we'll get to the multi-winner ones. So plurality, first past the post, Joanne talked about that, and about the 2-round runoff. Ranked choice voting, we've been talking about instant runoff and Borda. There's also a variant called Condorcet instant runoff voting, which I will also get a little bit further into later. But that one does satisfy the majority criteria. Well, I'm sorry, Borda does not. IRV and Condorcet IRV both satisfy majority criterion, but there's also something called the Condorcet criterion, which standard IRV does not satisfy and Condorcet does. So those are ranking methods. And then we shift gears a little bit to methods that are not based on rankings, but on ratings. And so picture Amazon.com or some other review site. You've bought a product, you really like it, you go and you give it 5 stars. Or maybe you don't like it so much, you give it 3 stars or 2 stars. That's a rating, not a ranking. You're not comparing directly one to the other. You're just saying who is better. So approval and score what I just described on Amazon is like a version of score rating. You give it a score of between 1 and 5 stars. And the range can vary. You can go from 0 to 10, or you can go from 0 to 100, or you can go from -5 to +5. Whatever you want the range to be, that's what the voter will assign to every candidate. So they're not ranking candidates, they're just giving their rating to every candidate that they want to rate on their ballot. And approval is actually like that, but much more simple. You just either give a check mark or not to every candidate that you give a check mark to everyone that you approve of. And then the way you tally those ballots is you just take all the ballots, count up all the approvals for the candidates, and whichever candidate has the most is the winner. And similarly for score, you're just summing up all of the scores for the candidates, and whoever ends up with the highest score is the winner. There's also a hybrid method known as STAR, which stands for score, then automatic runoff, which starts out as score. Every voter rates all of the candidates by a score of 0 to 5 or 0 to 10, whatever. And then you take the top 2 scorers out of all the candidates and then figure out how many voters preferred one over the other and how many preferred that other over the one. And then, so in the final round, the second round, it's more of a ranking, like how many preferred one over the other. And that one is the winner of the election. Now let's shift over to multi-winner methods. So block is one type of that. And I think this is a type that we don't recommend, but it's where, like in the past, when people were voting for president, they didn't take the shortcut and vote just for the presidential candidate. They voted for electors in some states as recently as 1960. In fact, I happen to know that from my research. But anyway, so if there's like 10 electors for your state, then each voter gets 10 votes and they vote for their 10 favorite electors. And then you take the top 10 people, the top 10 vote getters out of that whole set. Well, that's not very proportional because the people who represent a majority are dominating that sort of election. And that's what we kind of like to move on from. And then another version of plurality at large is where you have by place. And this is how Austin used to do it for our city council. We'd have place 1 election, place 2 election. I think there were 6 of them. I could be wrong, 6 or 8. But in that case, you're electing a multi-seat body, the council, but you're doing it essentially as 6 separate elections, where each one is judged, is tallied by plurality. And so that really overrepresents the majority again. Interestingly, there's also a preferential balloting that is block as well, can be called block preferential, sorry, where you rank your ballots and you fill multiple seats, but when somebody in the proportional version, which I'm about to talk about below, when you get your candidate elected, there's more to elect. Your vote doesn't count for so much because your vote was already dedicated to that candidate who won. But in this block preferential voting, your vote counts for as much for the second candidate, the second seat, I mean, as for the first. And so again, this overrepresents the majority. I may not be explaining that in as much detail as I need to, but you can look it up on Wikipedia if you're curious. Then we talk about, so those are non-proportional multi-winner methods. Then next we want to talk about proportional representation. So anytime we're electing a multi-seat body like a House of Representatives or a Senate, it'd be nice to have some proportionality there. And that's the idea behind party list PR, which is the version that's used in probably the majority of European parliamentary countries, where the voter votes not for a candidate directly, but for a party. And the number of seats given to each party is proportional to the number of votes the party got in the election. So it's as simple as that. You vote by party and it's proportionally distributed. Now there can be a threshold of 5%. So if a party doesn't get more than that threshold, then their votes are ignored. And also there's some variation within this category. You can either vote for a closed party list where the party leaders decide in what order to seat their people. So say a party gets 10 seats out of the election, the party leader gets to choose which 10 party guys or people are going to fill those seats. Or you can do it open party list style, where the voter also gets some say in which of the party officials will be the first to fill the seats. So anyway, then there's also mixed member proportional, which is the system used by Germany and New Zealand since the mid 90s, which when they had a referendum and they decided to adopt Germany's method. In this method, you do have single member districts. And so you have two types of representatives. One type is elected from a single member district and represents that district. But then depending on the vote shares, proportional vote shares, there's also a topping up from party lists at the federal level. So there are also representatives who are just there for the party and not representing a particular district on its own. And those are distributed in such a way that the final totals for each party is proportional to the number of votes that the party got. So that's a pretty interesting method, kind of a hybrid. And then we've talked about rating methods similar to approval and score. There's no reason why you can't extend that same idea to a multi-winner. Instead of just taking the person with the most approvals, take the 5 people with the 5 most approvals, or the 5 people with the 5 highest scores, something like that. I don't actually know a lot about these rating methods in the multi-winner context because they don't seem to be talked about as much, but the idea is pretty simple. And then finally, what's probably my favorite of the multi-winner methods is single transferable vote, which has been used in Australia for their Senate since the 40s, I believe, for quite a while, and as well as in Ireland. It's also used in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which Joanne mentioned earlier. They elect their city council by this method. And this is a ranked choice method. So every voter just ranks their candidates the same way as they do in instant runoff voting. Rank as many as you want, same exact balloting. It's just that the tallying is a little bit different. And you have a quota. Let me go on to the next slide because I think, okay, I'm going to get to this. But basically, okay, hold on. Okay, we'll talk through an example of STV in just a moment. But basically, you have a quota, and if somebody meets that quota, they take their seat. So they take the first out of 5 maybe, and we're electing 5 out of 10 candidates, let's say. If nobody reaches the quota, then you knock somebody out, somebody who came in last. Same way as in instant runoff voting, and you transfer their votes to the other voters. Now the difference is when somebody reaches the quota, so it's not only when somebody is eliminated, but also when somebody is seated and there's an excess, like say the quota is 1,000, but they get 1,200 votes. That's more than they needed. So that extra 200 gets redistributed as well for the next round. And that's the difference between the multi-winner STV and the single winner instant runoff. So why do we care about proportionality and why do we want multi-member districts? The problem in the past with multi-member districts at large, which were used quite a bit in American history, is that they overrepresent the majority. And I kind of just said that, but here's a visual example. You have blue with just a barely, slightly more than red in the electorate, and they get all of the representatives because it's winner take all basically. But multi-member districts with proportional representation is not at all the same as multi-member districts at large because they're explicitly non-proportional. And here's just another example of how that would work. I mean, in a single member district, you have the same problem as on the previous slide. It's winner take all, essentially, is the problem. But then if you do it proportionally, if you have an electorate that's very tightly contested and nearly split down the middle, and you have 2 representatives for that district instead of just 1, then it makes sense to have 1 blue or let's say Democrat, whatever it stands for, and 1 red, Republican or whatever, to represent that district. And you can have even more than 2 reps for the district. And the more, that's called the magnitude of the district, how many representatives are elected in a single election from it. And the more that you have, the more accurate the proportionality can be. I like to relate this back to what the Founding Fathers wrote about somewhat. John Adams in 1776 said that the principal difficulty lies and the greatest care should be employed in constituting this representative assembly. It should be in miniature an exact portrait of the people at large, and it should have an equal representation, or in other words, equal interest among the people should have equal interest in it. So that's to me, that's a straightforward endorsement of proportionality. So I think he would have approved of this type of voting methods that we're talking about today. And I'll just throw in one more Founding Fathers reference here, which is Alexander Hamilton, who said that he's talking here about the Electoral College, which is a little bit of a wrinkle because it's indirectly elected at the time, and still in some ways, in a lot of ways. But I just think it's really interesting what he said here. It might be unsafe to permit less than a majority to be conclusive. So in the case of the Electoral College, if nobody gets 270 electors, it goes to the House because you need that majority in order to be conclusive. So I just think it's really interesting that he knew way back in 1788 that you shouldn't just call the election over and declare a winner until somebody has a majority. Now, here's the history of multi-member districts in the US, and I just want to show this because some people think that we've never really had much experience with this. But no, in the early days of the Republic, up to the 1840s, and somewhat beyond that, there were a lot of representatives for the US House of Representatives that were elected from multi-member districts. And this goes up to almost 40%, almost 45%, excuse me. I ended this graph in 1981 just for space, but nothing has changed since the 70s. This all changed starting in 1967, where a statute was passed by Congress requiring single-member districts for the states, for the U.S. House. And that was because, well, there are probably a couple of reasons for that, but one of them was because it was the civil rights era, and they wanted to make sure that multi-member districts at large weren't being used to suppress minority votes, which is a well-known tendency that they do have. But again, these were all the wrong type of multi-member districts. These were at large, not proportional. And I also have another chart. This is on my blog if you want to check it. And I'll be sharing these slides with y'all later and whenever we publish the video for this meeting. But this is the same thing for Texas. In certain periods of our past, we've had 100% of reps for the House, elected from multi-member districts. Now, I promised I'd talk a little bit more about single transferable vote, the multi-winner version of ranked choice voting. And so I mentioned the quota. And here I took a little screenshot from a video, which I have a link to right here, which I would highly recommend. It's only 2 minutes long, and it goes through an example of electing 4 people to a student council. And they've got cartoon characters here as examples. And what we see is that in the first round, Mickey Mouse has broken through the quota, which we computed as 1,001 because there are 5,000 voters and we're seating 4 members. So you add 1 to the 4 and divide into 5,000. So you get 1,000 and add 1 to that. So the quota is 1,001 in this example. That changes with every election, of course. But Mickey Mouse has won in the first round with more than the quota. And that circled area is his excess, which will be then redistributed based on the proportions. It's kind of a complicated calculation at that point to know. You don't just like randomly select those few excess voters. You take the whole block of Mickey voters and figure out what the proportions of their second preferences are to redistribute. And then so once you redistribute that, then you see in the next round, has anybody broken through the quota? If so, then they are seated and the same thing happens again. If not, then we eliminate them and redistribute those votes, all of those votes, just the way that we did in single winner instant runoff voting. And so this is a great way to produce a proportional assembly of people who represent accurately the interests of the public. And to do it, I think it's probably a little bit more easy for Americans to accept a voting method like this, where you're voting for candidates instead of parties, as you do in the party list system. So that's why this is a pretty appealing method, in my opinion. Now, incidentally, gerrymandering, which is something that I know a lot of people are very concerned about and spend a lot of time working on, kind of evaporates when you go to a proportional representative system, at least if you have enough district magnitude. And what I've read in political science literature is that if you have a district magnitude of around 5 or more, then there's really no scope for gerrymandering. It becomes not profitable at all for the political consultants and whoever is trying to rig the maps to play that game. And I show here an example of an electorate which has 60 voters. So 40% of them are red, and 60% of those are blue. And then so that's shown here in the graphic image A. Then B is a way of gerrymandering, or of districting at least. I don't want to be too judgmental, I guess, but to district this so that red gets no representatives at all, because each of those 6 districts has a majority blue, minority red. And then conversely, if you were working for red as a political consultant, say, you could conceivably rig things so that blue only gets 2 seats. And that's by doing the thing here and shown in C, which is a pretty unnatural looking way of districting, but it gives red a majority in, let's see, 4 out of the 6 seats. So they're getting 4 out of 6 despite being a minority of the electorate. Now let's switch in D and E here to a proportional system where you've got 2 districts electing 3 each instead of 6 districts electing 1 each. And the upshot is that you're going to get, in D, you're going to get two blue reps and 1 red rep from one district, and the same for the other district. So you're going to have 4 blue and 2 red, which is kind of proportional. It's not exactly 60-40. It's more like 67-33, but that's not too far off, right? If you're working for red as a political consultant, you might be able to rig that a little bit more in your favor by doing what's shown in E here. But it's still only going to give you 50%. It's going to be 3 and 3. So that's still not too far off from the 60-40, and that's the best you can do. Now I want to talk briefly as I can, about the Condorcet criterion, which was based on the Marquis de Condorcet, who was a French mathematician in the 18th century, who was known to Jefferson and probably Franklin and Madison and some of those guys. He studied voting methods, and he came up with what's called the Condorcet winner criterion, which says that if there's a candidate who wins all pairwise comparisons, so look at all the rankings from all the ballots and compare candidate A with candidate B, then compare candidate A with candidate C, and then candidate B with candidate C. So head to head each time for all of the candidates in the election. And if there is a candidate who wins all of those pairwise comparisons against all the other candidates, that is, they're preferred by a majority in each case, then we call that person the Condorcet winner. And a Condorcet method is a method that makes sure that such a winner is elected when they do exist. Now, they don't always exist. Sometimes there's a candidate who gets a majority against one, but not a majority against another, and there's no candidate that gets a majority against every other candidate. Kind of think maybe of a 3-way game of rock, paper, scissors, right? What if one person throws rock, one person throws scissors, and one person throws paper? Who wins? They all beat each other. It goes in a cycle, okay? So that's what we can have. That's the Condorcet paradox, which he also wrote about, that you can have cyclical majorities among pairs of candidates. And so in that case, you just don't have a Condorcet winner. And so you just fall back on another method for deciding how to proceed with that. But standard IRV does not satisfy this Condorcet criterion, because you can have somebody who defeats all other candidates pairwise but is not elected, and that's because IRV is very sensitive to the order of elimination. And let me just switch over here to my calculator. I did this little voting exercise the other day, and we're gonna use this calculator later for the exercise that y'all are doing. But this is an example of an instant runoff winner who is not the Condorcet winner. These were the ballots that I plugged in, 12 of them. 2 of them were spoiled. Incidentally, you might be curious about that. This one was spoiled because he didn't put a second place choice right there. And this one was spoiled because he voted for Felix twice. Hopefully the ballot might, disallow that. This one didn't, and I was just, testing out various cases. But we've got 10 valid ballots right here. And what we do with that is, so these are first place, second place, third place, and so on for each voter, row by row. And notice that Mickey Mouse only gets 1 first place vote. But a lot of people, if you look through them, a lot of people are putting Mickey second or a little bit lower, third. He's pretty popular. He just doesn't get that many first place votes. So here's an instant runoff voting tally. sorry, I explained that badly. I should have been talking about Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny didn't get too many first place votes. This one is the spoiled ballot, and this one is so this is his only valid first place vote. And so here in the instant runoff tally, we're going round one. How many people put so and so as their first choice vote? Only one person did that for Bugs, and so he gets eliminated. And then we go on to round two, and Mickey Mouse ends up winning. Now, Mickey actually had only one in the first round too, so that was a random choice, I guess, or alphabetical. I'd have to check my program. But this shows how maybe you can picture how a pretty popular candidate gets eliminated in the first round just because he didn't have a lot of first place votes. But then if we look down here at the matrix, what you do to compute a Condorcet winner is you construct this matrix. So Bart Simpson versus Bart Simpson is meaningless. Bart Simpson versus the Pink Panther, 7 preferred Bart Simpson over Panther, 6 preferred Bart Simpson over Wile E. Coyote, etc. Let's look at Bugs Bunny's row. So Bugs Bunny has, so out of 10 voters, a majority is 6, and he has more than 6 or more in every case versus, that is, against every other candidate pairwise. And so Bugs Bunny is the Condorcet winner. Let me go back to my slideshow. I don't know if we'll see that in the exercise, but we might. It'll be exciting. So that's the Condorcet criterion. And Condorcet, this is basically what I've just gone over, the pairwise comparison and how you construct that. You have, these are like ballots over here on the left. So 2 of the ballots had A first, then B, then C. So that means they prefer A over C and they prefer A over B. And that's the information you would use to fill in this matrix. So Condorcet IRV, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit. I thought there was another slide, but basically I just wanted to say that Condorcet IRV is a version of IRV where you follow the standard rules of IRV, but you never eliminate a Condorcet winner. So whenever it comes time to eliminate somebody because they came in last, do an extra check. Ask, are they a Condorcet winner? Do the calculation. If they are, then choose the next to last candidate instead of the last place candidate to eliminate. And actually, that essentially means that whenever you find a Condorcet winner, they are going to be winning because they will never be eliminated. So you can take a shortcut at that point if you want. Or if you just want to go through the rounds, to go through the motions, it's kind of helpful maybe from a pedagogical perspective to show how things went. You can do that too. Now, what's the bad news? Well, the Constitution really leaves elections up to the states for the most part, but it also gives Congress the power to regulate elections. And Congress has occasionally used that power. It did so last in 1967 when it, well, I don't know if that was the last time, but it did so in 1967 when it mandated single-member districts for the House of Representatives. And like I mentioned earlier, that was in response to the minority suppressing tendencies of multi-member districts at large. And so we would need to do something about that to allow this for the federal House elections. We need to repeal that mandate. There's nothing in the Constitution. It's only a statutory thing. And then ranked choice voting is not allowed in Texas, as Joanne pointed out to y'all, for cities over 200,000. It's actually not really spelled out in the election code, but it is the statement based on the Attorney General's opinion, which he issued in response to an Austin query from 2001. And he said that the meaning of the word majority is majority in the classic or traditional sense, i.e. a majority that consists of more than half of the original votes as cast and not reassigned. Well, that doesn't really make sense too much though, because like, what about 2-round runoff elections? Say there are 10,000 voters in the first round and only 2,000 show up in the runoff. And the winner from that is determined by a vote of 1,200 versus 800. So they only got 1,200 votes. That's not a majority of 10,000. So, this is faulty logic in my opinion. It does guarantee that the winner has a majority of candidates in the final round where they won. And why would you compare their vote total in one round with the number of voters in a different round? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And then, so that's that obstacle. The other one is, multi-member districts kind of just have a bad name because of their history of being involved in suppressing minority votes, as I've mentioned several times. So that's multi-member district at large, not the proportional version of it. And then, like Joanne also mentioned, the politicians are somewhat reluctant to change a system that they have succeeded with. And there's just resistance to change. So we've got to get over that. I think there are ways to push back against that. And for one thing, I don't think politicians are very happy with their jobs at the moment. They spend all day calling donors and things like that. So the system definitely could be improved, and maybe having more choices would, having more strength of voice for the voter would help with that. I've got a lot of other ideas about that too, but they're a little bit outside the scope of this slideshow. So basically, what I think is that this is pretty much a relatively small change. We're not amending the Constitution. We're not, doing anything in terms of multi-member districts that hasn't been done before and isn't done by tons of other countries in the world. Ranked choice voting is done in a lot of places, and so it's not that big of a deal to change, but it would make a big difference in the quality of our democratic governance, I believe. And I like to think of us in terms of comparing us to other countries. When you do that, I think you see that we're the only democratic country that has such a duopolistic party system. Other countries have way more choices. Even countries like the UK that has traditionally been considered a two-party system. You look at Parliament over there, and well, sure, there are two major parties, but Parliament has 9 or 10 parties at least of people who actually have seats. We don't have any of that. We haven't had any third parties represented in Congress. There are some independents, but no third parties for many decades, until actually a few months ago when Justin Amash became a libertarian. But he wasn't elected that way. So we've got an exclusive duopolistic system, which is incredibly unusual in the world of democratic countries. We also have a lot worse problem with gerrymandering than other countries. And so I'd just like to throw out the idea that these things may be non-coincidental. These things may be related to each other. Now, what can we do about it? Well, if the Fair Representation Act, which was proposed by Representative Beyer from Virginia, was passed, it would repeal the 1967 mandate and require multi-winner ranked choice voting, that is the single transferable vote, STV, in House elections. And of course, some states only have one rep, so they would just use single winner ranked choice voting, I guess. But other states where they have more than one could use multi-winner single transferable vote. So that would be great. That's what we should aim for, in my opinion. It's going to be a tough sell, I know, but I've been working on it. And if you want to read more about it, there is a link right there to my book, which was published last fall, Beyond Two Parties. So that's all for me. I'll back to Mike.
Okay, the first question is, has there been much polling on what the general population thinks about this approach? Does it tend to have any partisan flavor to it? This question actually came in just as we were closing the questions after Joanne's presentation.
Good question.
I think there is. I don't have those polls at my fingertips, but I think people like it.
There is polling of those people, let's see, of voters before instant ranked choice voting was adopted and then subsequent to that. And that data is at Fair Vote. And there are quite a few, and I can put up on our blog post examples of polls that were done before and after that show that people are really pleased with the ranked choice voting concept.
Another question is whether these slides are going to be shared, and are the underlined words links to the source material. Yes, it will be shared. In fact, I'm just about to put the URLs for the slides and if I get my notes here, the slides and the calculator and the I'll put the calculator in the chat first to everyone. So if you're interested, look in the chat. There's the ranked choice voting calculator. And next I'll put in the URL for the slides.
And the URL for my slides will be up shortly, but I added a slide or two after I uploaded the slides to the website. So.
And the third question is, if I understood correctly and gerrymandering will be insignificant, then this feels like it will never happen. That's more of a comment than a question or a challenge. Who wants to answer the challenge?
Yeah. Well, I agree. It's a tough problem. I deal with it in my book some, and I already mentioned that I think politicians are not so happy with their careers. I feel like if we had a multi-party system where parties were not trying to be all things to all people and constantly hedging and being more stable in terms of their ideological output, that would be a more attractive career for politicians to go into, because the ideological foundations wouldn't be so shaky underneath their feet. I mean, for example, the Republicans for most of my life have been known as the free trade party. I mean, if you were for free trade and against protectionism, that would incline you toward the Republican Party. But now all of a sudden we have somewhat of a nativism streak going on, and they're all of a sudden very protectionist oriented. So that's what I mean by the ideological incoherence of the party system as it currently exists. And another thing is, just as with any reform, if the voters care about it enough, then they can exert some pressure. Well, you say, how do you exert that pressure? The best way would be through your vote, but of course the catch-22 there is the spoiler effect. The best way to signal that you don't like the current situation is to vote for a protest candidate. But then you might be shooting yourself in the foot, right? Because the election could end up spoiled. Well, yes and no. Sometimes yes, but then sometimes the race is so lopsided that it's not going to make a difference anyway. And that third party could really benefit from getting 5% or 10% of the vote, because that helps them the next time for their ballot access. And it's a way to send a message.
And from the Texans for Ranked Choice Voting perspective, in fact, the COVID-19 pandemic has made ranked choice voting position almost more acceptable because of the fiscal note that goes along with voting, that counties are really going to be hurting in terms of how costly it's going to be for voting to take place. So if you can eliminate the runoff, then you have that much more savings. So from a fiscal note perspective, ranked choice voting is a positive.
I don't have any more questions.
Okay, maybe it's time for me to close the voting on our
Right.
poll here. I'll do that now. And it'll take me just a couple minutes to tabulate and show the calculator results. So.
I might mention that to those people who are on the website, and I haven't mentioned this to the board yet, so I'm speaking only from a proposal perspective. One of the things that Common Ground for Texans has wanted to do was to expand our audience. And one way to expand our audience might be to continue doing both in-person and Zoom meetings in the future. So we might have one meeting quarterly of a topic that is that could be favorable to the country as a whole, and other meetings that are more associated with Central Texas, where it might not be advantageous for people from all over the country to view. But there is also a possibility that even when we have in-person meetings again, that we might be able to do a combination of Zoom and in person simultaneously, which could expand our viewership tremendously. It would be more costly. We'd have some expenses along with it, but that is possible.
Well, I have the results, so I will share my screen again and show them to you. All right, so we had 15 ballots, and these are the ones. So again, we just have a timestamp at the front. This is Google Forms format. And then, for example, this first voter voted for Wile E. Coyote first, Felix the Cat second, Bugs Bunny third, Bart Simpson, Mickey Mouse, and so on all down the list. This one only voted for their top three, and that's cool. But a lot of people voted for all five. And this is how the tallying went. In round one, we had three candidates with 3 top place votes. Bart Simpson had 5 first place votes, but again, he needs 6. No, out of 15, he needs 8 to be the winner. And so Felix the Cat was eliminated with only 1 vote, and there it looks like theirs got redistributed to Mickey, because Mickey's tally went up from 3 to 4. But still, nobody has a majority, so Wile E. Coyote gets eliminated, and their votes get redistributed. 2 went to Bugs, and 1 went to Bart Simpson. And still nobody has a majority. So the last place person is Mickey Mouse with 4 votes. Those votes, the candidate gets eliminated, and we transfer those votes. And it looks like 3 of them went to Bugs Bunny, and the other one must have gone to, I don't know, where'd it go? Exhausted? I can't see here with the Zoom. No, okay. Don't know where that one went. Anyway, Bugs Bunny wins with 9 out of 15. Now I also compute the border count, and in this case, it's not surprising. We have this many points for all these candidates, and Bugs wins in that version too. And then Condorcet IRV, Bugs Bunny, it was the Condorcet from the very beginning. These are his full preferences from all the ballots. Looks like nobody is preferred by more than, well, Bugs is preferred by at least 9 to every other candidate. So I happen to agree, Bugs is great. Bugs Bunny, awesome. So that's that.
So we will send out an email message when the video and all the links to all the slides are made available. But that email goes out to members, for followers who are on our email list. If you would like to continue to receive information from us, please sign up for our mailing list. And we only send 3 emails a month, so you're not going to get inundated by email. And we love to have you to continue following what we do. So when the announcement goes out, I would say that if you're not part of our mailing list, but go to our website in about a week and see whether the blog post has been posted. It should be. And with that, Mike, I'll turn it back to you.
Hey, do we have any other comments or announcements? Are we ready to wrap up the meeting? Tobin.
There is a couple more questions have just come in. One is, why did Wile E. Coyote get eliminated when he had the same as Bugs in the second round?
Okay, that was probably random. If there's a tie, then you have to use a tie-breaking rule, and randomness is one way of doing that. There's various ways, and I have to check the code to see exactly what happened. I think it might be alphabetical, if I recall correctly, but it could just be random.
And then there's one other question raised. Might people have a harder time understanding why the winner won when the calculation is as complex as it is?
Yeah, so that's why I think it's somewhat useful to have a calculator that lays it out visually in this way, or even potentially an animation. I mean, not to be too futuristic, but what if we had a computer that took the ballots and produced a quick little animated video, which would, I think it'd be quite possible to program that.
Mhm.
That would be very easy to understand.
Another question, will this recording be shared? Sorry if that was said earlier and I missed it, but it's worth repeating. Yes, it will be shared.
And you can
There'll be
share
a
it with
blog-
anyone that you like to share it with by
Yep.
using the URL.
Yeah, there will be a blog posting on the Common Ground website in much less than a week. And it'll contain the video and also the URLs of the slides, both Joanne's and Dan's slides, and Dan's calculator.
Yeah, and feel free to use that calculator just for whatever use you need. It takes comma separated value format. There's a little explanation at the bottom of the page. So hopefully it won't be hard to use.
And
come-
I hope some
There's a
folks
comment.
will join the Texans for Ranked Choice Voting group because we do need as much help from various places as we can attract.
Debbie Voss says that the questionable redistributing of votes is the most confusing.
Yes. Agree.
Well, when somebody is eliminated, you just whoever voted for that person, their next preference is what gets counted for the next round. Now, in the case of the quota, yeah, that's a little more complicated. When somebody wins a seat and they have an excess above the quota, so then that excess gets proportionally redistributed. That is a little bit of a calculation involved with that. But if you watch that video that's on that slide that I had of the showing Mickey Mouse getting seated, there's a 2-minute video. Just to visualize it, I think it makes it pretty understandable. I mean, yeah, you may not understand all of the details of the calculation, but I don't think the voter has to understand that. I think they just have to see, they have to know how to rank, which is easy. And then if they watch the results in an animated form or even just a graphical form, I think it's pretty straightforward.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Joanne. Again,
Mike.
our next meeting in Ham. Our next meeting is when, Joanne?
June 13 at 2:00.
June 13th. And the topic is, just to remind.
The topic, excuse me, is election security during COVID-19, how it will affect the July runoff election and the November election, what's happening in Travis County and all other counties within the state of Texas.
Great, thank you. I appreciate all the people showing up today. Wonderful questions. Great answers from Dan and Joanne. And with that, let's go out and enjoy the rest of the the holiday weekend here, folks. That's what we have.
Thank you, Mike.
Yes. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in.
Take care. Stay healthy.